Great. So yeah, hi everyone again, and thanks so much for joining me today. My name's Joe. I'm the L&D consultant here at Cornerstone Resources. Today's session is called When Performance Becomes a Risk, and we're going to focus specifically on escalation, evidence, and HR involvement today for the next half an hour. As you'll know, performance management is something many managers have to deal with. It's part of everyday working life. Usually, the early stages are relatively straightforward. An expectation's not been met, a deadline's been missed, or a piece of work needs to improve. But the difficulty is really knowing when that concern is no longer just an ordinary management issue and is beginning to create a wider risk. So, over the next 25 minutes, we'll look at how managers can recognize that change, what useful evidence looks like, and then when it may be appropriate to involve HR or other senior stakeholders. I will, as I've said just now, I'll be recording the main content portion of today's session, so the information can be shared afterwards. I'll also share the slides with you. But just to help us keep to time and cover the key content, I just appreciate if everyone could remain on mute during the main presentation. I'll ask a few multiple choice questions as we go. If you've not attended these sessions before, I just tend to ask a few multiple choice questions and you just need to put a letter into the chat. Quite easy interaction. If you can contribute to that, that'd be great. But the purpose really is to help us think through some of these decisions that managers need to make. I will also leave some time at the end for questions. You can submit those through Mentimeter by scanning the QR code on the slides, which we'll see on the next slide. And I'll pick up as many as I can. If I don't get to them or I can't answer them today, I will come back to you. So if you could just leave your email as part of your question, if you have one. I probably will cover most things on the slides, but if you have a question, I can always come back to you afterwards, or your consultant can if you work with us. So that's it for all the housekeeping. So by the end of today's session, you should be better able to do four things. So first, recognize some of those common warning signs that suggest a performance concern may be escalating. Second, understand when HR senior leaders or trustees need to become involved. Third, identify some of the informal management approaches that can unintentionally increase risk. And then finally, understand what good evidence looks like when managing a performance concern. So this isn't intended to turn you into a HR specialist. It's just to help you recognize when something needs more structured attention or when it's sensible to ask for advice as well. So before we get into the content, let's just start off with a quick question about your own experience. So there's no right or wrong answer here. This is all about yourself. Which part of managing performance do you personally find most challenging? So is it A, knowing when to escalate a concern, B, having difficult performance conversations, C, keeping appropriate evidence, or D, knowing when HR should become involved? So just in the chat, if you could just put A, B, C, or D, this helps us get a feel for the room. Thank you. So I can see a mix coming through. We've got knowing when HR should become involved, knowing when to escalate, having difficult conversations. Yeah, absolutely. I'd expect to see this mix coming through. Brilliant. So thank you for sharing those. It's common for managers to feel relatively confident identifying that something's not going well, but less confident about what should happen next. So that's what we're going to cover a bit more today, because that conversation itself can be the hardest part, and knowing where the threshold is as well. So let's just begin with an important principle. Performance concerns rarely become serious all at once. So performance issues rarely become that high risk thing overnight. They often begin with something relatively small. So it may be one missed deadline, one piece of work below the expected standard, or one occasion where someone has not fulfilled the responsibility as you expected. That becomes much more significant when it's repeated. So the repeated concern then begins to have an impact. Other people may need to absorb work, or customer or service user may be affected, or confidence within the team may reduce. If the concern continues without being addressed clearly, the organization may then begin to face a wider risk, which we'll talk about today. Eventually, a formal process may need to be considered, and the key point here really is that managers usually have more options early in the process than they might think. When concerns are identified and addressed promptly, there may be a greater scope for support, clarification, coaching, and informal improvement. But when things are left too long, the available choices often become narrower, and that's where we start to see formal escalation. So the aim is not to escalate everything quickly, it's to avoid allowing something manageable to drift until it becomes harder to resolve. So the earlier concerns are recognized and addressed, the more options as a manager that you usually have. So to explore this, just going to look at one fictional employee throughout today's session to really help apply this into a real world scenario and hopefully give you something really tangible to take away from today. So I'd like you to meet Alex. Alex has worked for the organization for 3 years and has previously been viewed as reliable and credible and capable. Over the last 6 weeks, their manager has noticed some changes. Alex has missed two project deadlines. They've arrived late to three team meetings. On a few occasions, colleagues have completed tasks that Alex has not finished. However, the quality of Alex's completed work does still remain good. And that final point is quite important. This is not a situation where everything has suddenly gone wrong. Alex has previously performed well, and when work is completed, the quality remains strong. So, throughout today's session, Alex's situation will develop, and at different points, I'll ask you to decide what you think Alex should do next, really. So, to help managers make these decisions, there are three questions I would encourage them to ask, which we're going to look at today. First question is this becoming a pattern? Are we looking at an isolated mistake or are similar concerns happening repeatedly? The second question is, could this become a wider organizational risk? So is the concern now affecting colleagues, customers, service users, well-being, fairness of the organization more broadly? The third question is, would my evidence explain what has happened? So if another manager, a HR advisor, or a senior leader or trustee looked at the situation tomorrow, would they understand what had happened and why decisions have been made? So these three questions are useful because they stop us focusing only on the most recent incident. They encourage us to look at the wider journey. So a manager may be dealing with something that still appears relatively informal, but if it's becoming a pattern, having an impact and not being recorded, the risk may already be increasing. So there's a lot to sort of bring into your decision making here. So let's look at that or take that first question in more detail. A pattern may be developing when similar concerns keep occurring. So that does not mean each incident must be identical. The common thread could be missed deadlines, unreliable attendance at meetings, unfinished work, or repeated failure to meet the same expectation. A pattern may also be developing when previous conversations have not led to improvement. Perhaps the manager has already clarified expectations or offered some support, but the same issue is continuing. The impact on other people is also an important sign. Once colleagues regularly have to compensate for someone else's performance, this is no longer simply an issue between the manager and that individual. Managers should also notice when they find themselves having the same conversation repeatedly. And if you feel as though you're saying, we've spoken about this before, that's often a sign that a clearer and more structured approach is needed. So, one mistake may be manageable, repeated concerns require closer attention. So, let's return to Alex again and decide what the manager should do at this early stage. So here's what we know so far. Alex has missed two deadlines. They've been late to several meetings. Colleagues have completed some unfinished work. There's been one brief informal conversation. However, when Alex completes work, the quality does still remain good. So what do you think is the most appropriate next step? We've got A, arrange a clear and supportive conversation and agree expectations. B, monitor Alex's performance for another few weeks. C, ask HR to lead the next performance conversation. Or D, put an informal improvement plan in place immediately. So what do you think is the appropriate next step? Yes, I can see a lot of A's coming through here. Absolutely, that would be the strongest answer here with the information that we have at this point is the strongest next step. So at this stage, the strongest next step is usually to arrange a clear and supportive conversation. The manager needs to describe the specific concerns that means avoiding vague statements such as your performance has not been good enough. Instead, the manager should identify the missed deadlines, the lateness, and the unfinished work. They should also explore whether anything is affecting Alex. That doesn't mean avoiding the performance issue, but it does mean understanding whether there are barriers, personal circumstances, or support that might be relevant. The expected standard should then be clarified. So Alex needs to understand what good performance would look like from this point forward. And finally, the manager should agree actions and a review point because without that follow up, the conversation may simply become another informal chat that neither person can clearly refer back to. So that follow up, that agreement of actions is really important. So if we look at the other options that we had, option B, that was simply monitoring for another few weeks. That can just risk allowing the concern to continue without Alex fully understanding what needs to change. Option C places ownership with HR just a bit too early. HR can advise, but the manager should normally remain responsible for managing performance. And option D, it may eventually be appropriate, but it's too early to impose an improvement plan before the manager's held a proper conversation and understood the situation. So it's great to see those answers coming through and they align with what I've come up with here as well. So early conversations should combine clarity, curiosity, and support. And the second question is really about impact now. So if we look at that second question, is the concern beginning to become a wider organizational risk? So performance becomes more than an individual concern when it begins to affect other areas. So that could be customers or service users that may experience delays or a reduction in quality. Other team members may need to take on additional work. Morale may be affected, particularly where colleagues believe expectations are being applied inconsistently. There may be concerns about quality or safety. The organization's reputation may be affected if commitments are repeatedly missed. Fairness and consistency is also important too. So if one employee's performance is repeatedly overlooked while others are held to the expected standard, that can create frustration and undermine trust in the manager as well. So the number of mistakes matters, but the impact of those mistakes often tells us more about the level of risk. So again, let's see how Alex's situation has developed now. Over the following month, Alex misses another important deadline. Two colleagues are now regularly taking on additional work. Customer response has been affected. The manager has held two informal conversations and has offered some temporary support. Alex has explained that they are experiencing personal pressures outside work. However, the manager's written records are quite limited at the moment. So there are several things happening at once here. There's a continuing performance concern. There's now a clear impact on colleagues and customers. There's also personal context that should be handled sensitively and appropriately. And then finally, the manager has very little evidence of what's already been discussed or agreed. So the concern is no longer affecting only Alex. So what should the manager do next? That's the real question. So which action do you think would create the strongest next step? So we've got A, introduce a formal performance improvement plan. B, temporarily redistribute Alex's most urgent work. C, record the concerns and seek HR advice now. Or D, agree further support and review progress in 1 month. What do you think would be the next strong step? Just want to pop a letter in the chat. Yeah, I can see some coming through now. Great. Yeah, here, that's absolutely right. The strongest answer with again with the information that we have would probably be C here. So recording the concerns and seeking HR advice now. Other answers, again, if you play other context into there, we're talking about a hypothetical situation here, but if you play other context in, you might make a different decision. But with what we have, I would suggest C here, record the concerns and seek HR advice now. And I'll explain why. So the manager should now record the concerns and seek advice from HR. That doesn't mean HR automatically starts a formal process. It also doesn't mean the manager has failed to manage the situation themselves as well. Early advice can really help the manager understand the position before risk grows further. So HR can review what informal steps have already been taken. They can help the manager consider Alex's personal circumstances appropriately. For example, there may be a health or well-being issue that needs further exploration, support, or a different type of conversation. HR can check that the approach is fair and consistent with how similar concerns have been managed elsewhere. They can help improve the quality of the records as well and advise whether further informal support is appropriate or whether a more structured process should be considered. So if we look at the other options that were available, because this is a bit more difficult one, this one sometimes. Option A may eventually be appropriate, but it would be sensible to review the position with HR before moving to a formal improvement plan. So it's not to say we wouldn't go there, it's just saying review the position with HR, really. Option B may help protect immediate customer delivery, but redistributing work alone does not resolve the underlying concern. And then option D, that offers further support, but waiting another month without seeking advice would probably allow the impact to continue. So seeking advice early creates more options, and that's what I talked about at the start of this session. Doesn't automatically mean the situation's formal if we can start to act early and have as many options as we can. So now imagine that another manager, HR advisor, or trustee reviewed this situation tomorrow. Would they understand the full story? So would they know that what the original concern was and when it happened? Would they understand what standard Alex was expected to meet? Would they know what impact the concern had on colleagues, customers, service users, or the organization? Would they be able to see what the manager said, what support was offered, and what actions were agreed? Would they know what happened afterwards as well? So this is not about creating a file designed to prove that Alex is at fault, but good evidence should be balanced. It should record the concern, but it should also record the employee's explanation, so the support provided as well, and any progress that does take place in between conversations as well. So good evidence should tell the story from beginning to end. First, what happened, use specific facts, examples, rather than labels or broad conclusions, so keeping things fact-based. Second, when did it happen, include dates or clear timeframes. Third, what was expected. The employee really needs to understand the standard, the objective, or responsibility they were expected to meet. Fourth, what was the impact? Talked about impact quite a lot because it's a big part of this. It's really important. So the effect on work, colleagues, customers, or services. What support was offered? This may include guidance, training, adjustments, resources, or review meetings. And finally, what happened next? So a useful record should include agreed actions, progress, further concerns, and then that next review point. And a note simply says Alex, I spoke to Alex about performance. That just tells us very little. We need to be a bit more detailed than that and a bit more factual because evidence should explain the journey, not simply record the final problem that we have as well. So now let's just test that with four possible notes from Alex's manager in this situation. So following a meeting with Alex, the manager now writes one of these four notes. In your opinion, which record would be the best support, would best support a fair review later? Just take a moment to read these four options on screen. So we've got A, this is a record that it records workload and deadlines that were discussed and that colleagues will provide support until the next review. B records the missed deadline, Alex's personal pressures, and an agreement to meet again. C, it records recent performance concerns and warns that further issues may result in formal action. And then D, it records the missed deadline, its impact, the expected standard, weekly check-ins, and then it has a review date as well. Which record, sorry, would be the most useful in your opinion? A, B, C, or D? Yeah, I'd agree with most of what people's coming through there. I think I can just see the answer D coming through there. Brilliant. So the strongest answer here would be D. And again, why that is it provides the strongest evidence because it gives us a clear but concise account of the conversation. It identifies the specific concern. We've got the missed deadline, we've got the impact, the standard expected, shows that support's been agreed through weekly check-ins. It includes clear next steps and a review date. And it's not especially long if you were to write that out, but it provides enough information for someone else to understand what's happened. If we look at the other options, so option A, it records temporary support, but it does not say what Alex is expected to improve. Option B, it includes useful context and a review point, but it doesn't record the impact or the expected standard. And option C, it records a warning, but it gives very little indication that the manager explored the situation, offered support, or agreed improvement actions as well. So it's also worth noticing that none of those actual shorter records, A, B, C, A, B, and C, they're not necessarily false. The problem is that they're just incomplete, really. Weak evidence often isn't inaccurate. It just simply leaves out some of the information needed to understand whether the manager acted fairly and reasonably. So, useful records are brief, factual, and clear about what happens next, but do cover all of what happened. So this leads us on to one of the biggest risks in performance management, remaining informal for too long as well. Because I've talked about being informal and how it's not a problem in itself. In many cases, it's the most appropriate and constructive starting point, but it does become risky when informal remains unclear, inconsistent, or undocumented. So, for example, hoping the issue just will improve itself, repeating the same conversations without recording them, giving vague or changing expectations, applying different standards to different people, avoiding HR because asking for advice can feel formal. We've seen that a little bit too. And then making long-term changes such as permanently redistributing someone's work without reviewing whether that remains appropriate. Another one could be allowing colleagues to absorb the impact indefinitely, or just moving suddenly into a formal process when the employee's not previously been told clearly that improvement was even required. Again, we've seen this, but what I've talked about so far, really up to now, is about having those conversations before we get to that point. And a conversation does not need to become formal simply because the manager writes down what's agreed. People can think documenting something is formal in itself. Sometimes just a brief written record can protect both the manager and the employee by creating shared clarity. So that can look like emails, just a shared note in a diary, in a file. Can be really simple, just agreed actions within a meeting that are written down and sent through to people. That's all very informal. When we're talking about formal, we're talking about improvement plans and investigations and disciplinary documents and things like that. So we can document and still remain informal as well. Because informal management is only helpful when it's clear, fair, documented, and actually actively reviewed as well. So who's responsible for each part of this process that I've kind of walked through so far? The manager remains responsible for managing the employee's performance. That includes setting expectations, giving feedback, exploring barriers, offering support, monitoring progress, keeping records. HR's role is to advise and support. So HR can advise on risk, process, consistency, fairness, and evidence. They may also help identify any legal, health, or well-being considerations that the manager needs to take into account. And then also, when a formal process becomes necessary, HR can support the manager through that process. Senior leaders or trustees will not need to become involved in every performance concern. Their involvement is more likely where there's a significant organizational, safeguarding, governance, or reputational risk. They may also just need to provide oversight where the employee concerned is particularly senior or where the decision has wider implications for the organization. Involving HR or senior stakeholders doesn't mean the manager has to hand over responsibility, though it's not a case of pass the baton on. It means the manager just receives the right level of support and oversight. So let's just finally return to Alex for this final stage of the scenario to see what we do now. So 6 weeks later, Alex's performance has not sufficiently improved. Weekly review meetings have taken place. Expectations have been clearly confirmed. Appropriate support's been offered. The manager now has an objective or has objective written evidence. However, the impact on colleagues and customers is continuing. HR has also provided informal advice at this point. So what would you think is the next appropriate step here? So if we have A, extend the informal review period with revised support. B, move into formal capability process with HR support. C, reallocate Alex's responsibilities on a permanent basis. D, issue a final performance warning at the next meeting. What do you think? Yes, I can see a lot of B's coming through there. Yeah, move into a formal capability process with HR support. And I think at this point, after everything we've gone through and all the information we have, the strongest next step would be B. So at this point, moving into a formal capability process with HR is appropriate. The concern's been established. It has an established pattern. We've got expectations communicated. They've received us support. There's evidence now in place. We've seen the impact on others. Informal management hasn't produced the sufficient improvement we wanted. And importantly, HR advice has all been sought as well. So we've covered all the bases there. It creates a more structured framework in which expectations, support, review periods, and possible consequences can now be explained as well. So the key thing really to think about here is there are six key takeaways I'd hope you take from this really, is that performance risk usually does develop gradually. Early conversations create more options for you. Patterns and impact matter. Evidence should tell the full story. So we're looking to create enough, we want to cover all the bases when it comes to evidence, not be too brief, include what happened, what conversations were had, the impact of those. HR advice doesn't automatically mean formal action. Again, if we can shift our mindset on that, that can help with just gathering informal advice. And then consistency also protects everyone involved. We need to treat people the same. employee, the manager, their colleagues, and the organization. There should be the same standard expected of everyone. So the key thing here really is to act early, be clear, keep evidence, and then ask for advice when you need to as well. So today's been a really short whistle stop. I know I spoke quite quickly. Short introduction to these principles. There are also opportunities to explore the skills in greater depth than what I've gone through today. So I actually deliver lots of sessions on this kind of topic. The first is Lead with Confidence. This is a program I deliver to managers to give effective feedback, hold difficult conversations, build accountability, and then manage performance more proactively. So that's something you can view on our website, which I'll send a link to afterwards when I send the recording and the slides round. The second program is very related to what we've done today. This explores how to conduct fair investigations from a manager point of view, gather and assess evidence, what that can look like, how to follow disciplinary processes, and then make balanced decisions. Because at some point, we all may have to be involved in this process, and it's good to have a good understanding of your responsibility or your managers if you're more senior than that today. It's good to have a good understanding of these responsibilities before it happens, because when it happens, it can actually be too late. So that's why it's important to have this training before it happens as well. So I'll send these links round, but do speak to the Cornerstone team about any appropriate next steps for your managers. You can speak to myself or your consultant if you do work with us in that way as well. Great. So I will just quickly check if we've had any questions. I think we've got one. I'll just see if we've got one here. Let's read it through. Great. So we've got one around how can you maintain equity, so fairness across the team when these conversations are private and so colleagues do not know what is happening. What we encourage people to do, and this is something we cover in the training in a bit more detail, is to not share the confidential details with everybody. Again, it's going to be clear that something might be going on, particularly if they're noticing someone's not pulling their weight. But it's about you can still acknowledge to your team that you are doing something about it, but not telling them the detail behind what's going on. You can say it's being dealt with, but I can't share any more detail than that. Again, it's not ideal. It's never going to be ideal, this situation. You're not going to have a perfect situation, but you've got to be careful about what you do share with people, but still transparent that you can tell your team we are dealing with it, just can't share the details behind it. And then hopefully you then start to see either moving through the process we've talked about with Alex, or you start to see performance improve as well. So there's no perfect answer to that one. I know that's a big challenge because I've been a manager. I am a manager, so I've seen that as well. Great. So thanks for the question there. If you have any other questions, do email me or email your consultant as well. That'd be great. But yeah, thanks everyone for your time today. I think we're just about to finish on 1 o'clock. So yeah, thanks again, and hopefully I'll see you at the next session. See you later.